UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak just made a big speech on net zero climate change targets. Because our narrative on this is polarised and stupid, the reactions on both sides have been relatively predictable. But mostly, people have missed the real shift that's just happened here, and whether you like the specific policy changes he announced or not, the shift is probably one that's long overdue and really had to happen. So let's have a look. First of all, let's just give the highlights of what changes the Prime Minister announced and how people have responded to it. The UK had, under Boris Johnson latterly, announced that it would move forward its target to ban, for instance, the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2035 to 2030. Sunak announced that would be pushed back again to 2035. The UK had suggested, although it hadn't gone through Parliament yet, that oil boilers used by people like the good folk who live in my village, who are not on the gas grid, new ones of those would be banned from 2026. And that new gas boilers used by many, many more people in the country would be banned from 2035. While pushing those back, he announced a new higher amount of government grant that would be available to households who wanted to make the move voluntarily to getting a heat pump fitted, £7,500, up from £5,000 previously. He also said there was a percentage of homes, I'm assuming old cottages, thatched roof cottages and the like, which could be only made ready for heat pumps at disproportionate cost, and they would never be forced to go that route. On the flip side, he said that more steps were going to be taken to make much faster progress in preparing the electricity grid to be capable of meeting greater demand, with the electrification of transport and home heating expected in the future. A number of Conservative voices, although not all, celebrated the move. Rishi Sunak, they said, had put common sense ahead of ideology. So, The Telegraph editorialised, these ambitions were unrealistic and almost certainly unachievable within the time frame, and it is to Rishi Sunak's great credit that he has sought to adapt the policy to make it workable, pragmatic and proportionate. A quick canter over to the other side, and you found The Guardian in somewhat different frame of mind. Rishi Sunak's decision to postpone deadlines for the transition to low-carbon technology is the very definition of tactical partisanship, trumping strategic statecraft. That the Prime Minister sought to present it otherwise in a televised address to the nation on Wednesday shows contempt for anyone who understands the urgency of the climate crisis. Al Gore, apparently, disapproved. Not what the world needs from the United Kingdom, he said. The Conservative Party, which has deepened its divisions on the issues over the last couple of years, was apparently in some disarray over the announcement, not least because it was leaked in advance to the BBC and Sunak's speech had to be brought forward a couple of days to cope. One member of the government reported, off the record, the WhatsApp groups are a bloodbath. Supporters of Boris Johnson's net zero commitments were kicking up big time, while former critics of Rishi Sunak, on the net zero sceptical end, well, they were praising his move and giving him their fulsome support. All of which is exactly as you would expect. Most of the commentary in the mainstream media on all of this has set into that knee-jerk response on one side or the other. Pro-net zero people saying that this is a disgrace, it's a huge betrayal, the world used to look at us as climate leaders and this now sends the wrong message to all of them, etc, etc. And, I don't imagine Rishi Sunak's going to set much store by those responses. The people saying such things never, that I ever saw, gave him or his predecessors credit when they took those positions. They never said then it was leadership. They always said it was too little too late, which is what happens when these things are debated by partisans who will never give credit where it's due if it's due to someone on the other side. And then the knee-jerk response on the opposite side as well, for people giving fulsome support, even though this policy shift only really moves things back to how they were before Boris Johnson, at which time they were then moaning about exactly the same commitments at that point. But something more significant has changed, as I said, and it's worth noting it here even if nobody else is. And, I first noticed it a month or two ago. Some BBC journalists did what journalists always do. Sunak had taken a flight somewhere, I think, to some event in Scotland or maybe somewhere nearby. I forget the exact occasion, but in any case, the journalist duly challenged him about whether taking a flight in that situation was really what should be happening in the light of net zero, etc., etc. And unlike every other politician that normally shifts uneasily in their seat and comes up with some weasel words as to, why this was unfortunate but necessary due to circumstances beyond their control, blah, 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 Sunak stood his ground and argued on a point of principle. He said that he challenged the premise, this narrative that the BBC was pushing, that net zero will be about telling people how to live their lives. That's not the vision we have, he said, and I'm not playing with your guilt trips. I'm probably paraphrasing slightly there, but it was definitely the spirit of his comment. And I remember it. My eyebrows were raised. Why? Because, as I've outlined here before, no Prime Minister since the time of Margaret Thatcher that I recall has made a campaigning case for their vision relating to the environment, relating to climate change specifically. Generally, they'd just gone along with the received wisdom. They'd made commitments, but seemed utterly incapable of articulating why or what their vision of the future would actually mean in practice for the country. Sunak was starting to show signs that he was going to define and defend a specific conservative vision of his own for how he approached net zero. Not only that, but it would be distinctive from that of Labour's. And that would mean that there would be a divide between the two of them that would become the focus of debate and argument. And Sunak then made that real in his speech this week. The part that journalists gave a lot less focus to, because it's a more subtle point than they have headspace for, I guess. I don't know. He talked about the need to move to net zero in a way that kept the support of people, didn't overburden them unnecessarily with costs. He talked about the fact that the costs and the trade-offs involved in the detail of meeting that target were significant, and that therefore they should be fully debated in the House and before the country when new measures were introduced. One of the most telling sceptics' complaints over recent years, and one that I've echoed here, is that policies have often been passed with zero scrutiny or challenge. Minutes worth of debate, not hours or days. Now, whatever policy you have, however passionately you believe it's needed to meet your end goal, you only ever benefit from challenge. Because without it, many people will miss important details, potential unintended consequences will fail to be teased out, and of course, if it turns out the proposal doesn't have support, well, you might think that's disastrous in the short term. Often it means that more work is done, better proposals come back capable of actually winning support. So now, with some genuine space opened up between the Conservative approach and Labour's approach, it becomes a topic for debate in the election. Every policy put forward will get opposition scrutiny, and that is wholly and absolutely a good thing. It's how the system of parliamentary democracy is meant to work, but had not been working in this area in the last few years. So when Boris Johnson made some figures up out of his head in a cloud of wishful thinking, for instance, simply deciding that the 2035 ban on new petrol vehicles, which many people saw as quite ambitious, could just be brought forward by 5 years. Nobody was looking sceptically at it and saying, what makes you think that a significant shift in ambition is realistic or achievable? Bear in mind, it's a question that could have a good answer, But given Boris Johnson's modus operandi, making big boosterist promises and then proving incapable of competent organisation compatible with making them actually happen, that scepticism would have been well placed. Now, it didn't happen, because whether it was realistic or achievable, all of the parties felt that it was desirable. Because the opposition had all positioned themselves as more serious on the environment than the Conservatives, so they could never question such a policy, only encourage it to go faster and further, regardless of how realistic it was. Hence, we ended up adopting a few fantasy policies, along with some that were ambitious but achievable, often those that were described by the Committee on Climate Change, which had produced a detailed report of what would need to be done by when. But they were only achievable if you then started the work immediately at the necessary scale, rather than promising big and then doing, frankly, bugger all. And now that Sunak has looked at all this and said, yeah, OK, we actually need to switch this to things that are practically achievable, that is then being deplored by the people on the other side as the betrayal of the children. Rishi Sunak trying to save his premiership by letting the world burn, which I have to say I feel is a little overblown for a policy that just pushes a few deadlines back in line with what everyone else in Europe has already committed to. But now that this has been opened up, the interesting thing is the dilemma it poses to the would-be government of Keir Starmer. Now, of course, he could simply say, we deplore all of this, so we will reverse it all on day one of a Labour government. And then he will face exactly the same dilemma. What out of all of these policies can actually now be delivered? Because, of course, if he becomes the Prime Minister, he suddenly has the responsibility of delivery, not just the luxury of opposition. So Labour has said, yes, it will reinstate the 2030 deadline for electric vehicles. Will that actually make it into the manifesto? Well, let's see, but they've said it. But Starmer has not been drawn on whether they would similarly reinstate the ban on new oil boilers or the ban on new gas boilers on their respective dates. The Conservatives are hoping that he will. They want to go into the election describing all of the pain that people would feel from those, after all, arbitrarily framed policies, the ones they should never have signed up to. They want to tell the electorate that, yes, they're still signed up to net zero, a target which the electorate supports in principle. Sorry, people in the comments below, but they do. But will get there in a way that doesn't devastate their finances. Many are sceptical that can be achieved. There is good reason for scepticism based on the policies that the Tories have right now. Nevertheless, it may still be more electable than promising policies that would give householders costs they simply can't afford, for no apparent defensible reason. You can see that this is for hope, because in addition to the points of substance, Rishi Sunak also made promises to abandon a bunch of weird proposals. Weird because nobody had actually proposed them. He was trying to imply that they had, and the Conservative way was to rule them out. A tax on eating meat. Well, he said, we definitely won't be doing that. New taxes on flying. Well, we won't be doing that either. Compulsory car sharing if you drive to work. Well, we won't push that on you. Government requirements to sort your rubbish bin into not 5, not 6, but 7 different bins. Hell no, we would never do it. Well, good. But nobody was proposing to do those things, or at least no one who has any remote vicinity to the levers of power. But to be fair, that's not the popular imagination, because the likes of the BBC obsess about meat eating and flying whenever climate change is mentioned. People would be only too ready to believe that eco-zealots had plans to do exactly those things. So in reality, no, not currently a thing, but I can understand why they might campaign that way. The point is, the shift is a good thing, regardless of which policies you actually support. Support Sunak's pragmatism? Fine, you'll be happy with that. Want to go further and faster? Fine. The nature of the choice you need now to sell to the country has become a lot clearer. But the quality of policy on both sides is now going to improve now that we've ended this false consensus, because you'll have to put in the detail of how those policies would work. If the opposition believe you can have an electric grid based purely on variable renewable sources, well, okay. My understanding is that's not possible as a matter of physics on the current state of the technology. But if it can be, great. Show us how. Put forward the detail as to how it can be made to work in practice. Personally, I don't care. I mean, I really don't have a policy prescription that I favour. Any policy has to be practically achievable. It has to meet the climate goal while providing affordable and sufficient energy for a thriving society. I think that's quite a big ask. There aren't 20 ways to do that, I'm guessing. And the Committee on Climate Change report back in 2018 said that it could be done, but with a mix of energy sources, including new nuclear power, major investment in the grid, energy storage processes such as batteries and green hydrogen, all of them. And they laid out what seemed to be hugely ambitious, but actually practically achievable, apparently. I say apparently because, again, it didn't get sceptical scrutiny, so we don't know where the errors were. I dare say there were a few. But if there's another way to do it, cool. Given the choice of different ways to do it, I might even have a preference. But I won't really mind if it goes to the other way to my preference. My instinct is the old way of setting targets with no real idea how you're actually going to meet them. That doesn't work. And I find environmentalists who say that climate change is an emergency, the preeminent emergency, but they won't for a second consider the potential role of nuclear power to be unserious. It's either an emergency, in which case you do everything you need to deal with that first, or it's an issue amongst several, in which case you might decide that whatever these qualms are that you have about nuclear power, they take precedence. Otherwise, they're simply demonstrating just how like Boris Johnson they really are. He too was famous for wanting to have his cake and eat it, kind of how we got here. So I'm delighted we now have a Prime Minister making a case and campaigning for their vision of the future, as Sunak has done. Doesn't necessarily mean I agree with his case or indeed disagree with it. It's just the dynamic of having clear visions and clear choices that is a massive breath of fresh air. It's then down to the electorate to make of it what they will, and down to the political parties to turn them into opportunities. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.